because of the guests that we have. So before we begin this forum, I'd like to inform all of you that this forum is being recorded. However, the recording will only capture the person who is speaking. And as another house rule is that we request that if you're not speaking, you kindly mute your microphone so that we are able to clearly get our speaker and hear from her insights. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Future Africa first of all. Future Africa is an organization that was started in 2016 to nurture the next generation of public sector leaders. And our guest today is an expert when it comes to public sector, public policy, and governance. And I'm going to talk about her shortly. My name is Mwenda Bundi. I am director of the Scholars Program. The Scholars Program is a 4-month research intensive program that helps to build the capacity, the writing capacity of Africans in developing solutions for African challenges. The forum, the Future Africa Forum, is a platform, is a quarterly seminar series where we invite policy experts and development practitioners within the public sector from across the continent to share their perspectives about public sector leadership, innovation, policy, etc. And I am excited about our guest today. So welcome all, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Natasha Kimani, who, for the purpose of this forum, allow me to also call her my friend. So I'm going to introduce her. Natasha Kimani is a constitutional lawyer, policy and governance expert, and advocate of the High Court of Kenya. She currently serves as the Regional Director, East Africa at Futurelect, of which I have the pleasure of being part of the inaugural cohort. In this role, Natasha is actively building a new generation of ethical political leaders and public servants to serve the region. She holds a Master of Arts in Law, Politics, and Public Economics from Leuphana University of Lüneburg, pardon my German, as a DAD scholar. Additionally, she is a Public Policy and Public Management Fellow from Virginia Commonwealth University as a Mandela Washington Fellow. She was an Academy Fellow at Chatham House, where she did groundbreaking research on gender-responsive devolution in Kenya. She's also a Mo Ibrahim Foundation Fellow, and her immediate past role at Africa No Filter centered on supporting African storytellers and the creative ecosystem to shift narratives about the continent. I would call her a Pan-Africanist. She has served in the Kenyan public sector at the Commission for the Implementation of the Constitution and the Kenya Law Reform Commission. She also serves on several boards, including Akili Dada, Mzalendo Trust, and Digital Economy Strategy Group. We invite all of you to engage with us in the chat box, and it gives me great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome Natasha Kimani, who will be speaking on inclusive policy innovation, and she'll be telling us what all that is about. Natasha, the floor is yours. Karibu sana.
Thank you so much, Manda. For a minute, I was like, who is he talking about? It's so lovely to be with you in Nairobi. It's 4 p.m., 4:15. Thank you for having me. Future Africa is doing incredible work, so allow me to say congratulations. And today I'm going to be speaking, and I'm timing myself, about inclusive governance and policy, what that means. And I'm going to be breaking it down to be a bit more practical than sort of technical and academic. And I'll just begin by prefacing it and why inclusive governance is important and what it even means when we say inclusive governance. Governance must be inclusive. Policies must be inclusive. Let's take a step back. Inclusion means in terms of both processes, who and decision making, how decisions are made and who is included in that process and how and why, and outcomes, how wealth and prosperity are distributed and shared across a population, and why, is a leading priority in international development and in sustainable development goals. And it's perhaps the most ambitious articulation of what inclusion means. So it's in twofold. It's one, in the process, how decisions are made and who is included, and two, in the outcomes. So when we're thinking about inclusive governance, let's think about it in those two strands. Who's included in the process, and how do these outcomes affect, the lives and livelihoods of Africans? How is wealth distributed and shared across different populations? And overwhelming evidence shows that over a long period of time, more open and inclusive states tend to be more prosperous. So it's actually to our benefit to be more inclusive as a continent and as individual countries, because even though we are a continent, we are not a monolith. African countries are different and face different challenges. And countries are more effective and more resilient, but it is far less clear how countries that today can be considered more inclusive in terms of both process and outcome got to where they are. So I think the reason I'm prefacing that is to say, sometimes we may think there's a formula and method to getting to where we need to go, and oftentimes there is not. And the reason why this is important to us is because as a continent, through the African Union, it is one of our key aspirations listed in Agenda 2063. Agenda 2063 is all about the Africa we want. The African Union's AU ship, it has a shared idea around development and transformation for realizing the full potential of the continent. And there's one that stands out. One theme that stands out, and it's interconnectedness. An Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. So therefore, the key to Africa's potential, politically and economic transformation in the next decade is found in this aspiration. And I think it's one we rarely think about. What does it mean when we say we want an Africa that's interconnected, and an Africa that espouses qualities of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights? When we break that down, what does it actually mean in a practical sense? And what does it mean for us to say, these are the things that we need to do to then ensure that governance and policies are inclusive? And I'd like to give some practical examples. I come from Kenya, and currently we are facing a disaster of floods. And the people most affected by the flooding crisis, who are losing their homes, who are losing their lives, are the poor and the marginalized in community and society. Therefore, when we are considering policies in regards to mitigating factors to protect citizens against floods, the people who should be considered first and foremost are the people who are going to be most affected. And I'll give an example of an area called Mathare in Kenya that has been the most affected in the capital city of Nairobi. When we are designing a policy of urban planning and development that ensures there's spatial justice, spatial justice means people have access to quality water, a quality environment that's free of waterborne diseases. They have access to medical care, affordable medical care that is efficient. They have access to schools, and they have access to living conditions that dignify them. When we think about the crisis that's happening in Mathare currently, would we then say that there has been inclusive urban development in that area? I'm not sure that we would. And I'm just going to take us through some steps as we think about what inclusive governance is about and why it matters, as we think about, what is this thing and why is it a crisis amongst us? The first thing is the best way to ensure that we are inclusive, first as a society, is to understand that there are very varying needs between different citizens in a nation. For example, if we're talking about the needs of men and women, access to healthcare means they're accessing healthcare at different points. For a majority of women on the continent, this means chances of maternal death due to inability to access quality healthcare may be high if we don't consider those elements and those factors. For children who live far away from hospitals and who have no access to hospitals, it means their lives could be at risk. And they are more vulnerable and more bound to be harmed because we've not developed in a way that includes their lived experiences and their current needs. And therefore, let me begin with the processes. How to ensure that the processes to creating proper outcomes are going to be inclusive and efficient. The first one is, who do you have in the room? Who's in the room with you when you're making the decisions? Oftentimes, when we say we are developing legislation and policy for Africans, and again, I'm going to speak as a Kenyan and the Kenyan experience, I cannot sit here and say I'm drafting legislation for Kenyan women. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I understand the lived experiences of a woman from Turkana. Drafting a policy that will alter her life means that she should be in the room with me, engaging with me and having conversations with me. So the first question again, who's in the room? Who are we consulting when we're drafting this particular situation? Is this a current and pressing need? In the next 10 years, is this going to be something that's needed? Is it a nice to have, or is it a must have? And the only way we can know if something is a nice to have or must have is if we consult the people and ask the questions. And that requires often what I say a majority of us don't have, and that's intellectual humility. The ability to say, I may have had a great idea as a leader, but that idea is not what is needed now. Therefore, do I have the intellectual humility to pack it and say, I'm going to address the current and pressing needs of my constituents? And oftentimes we've seen that that's rarely the case, because people come with their agendas. And when an agenda is brought to the table, sometimes it supersedes the needs of citizens. Number two is education. Implementing education programs to help citizens understand and appreciate not just the Constitution and its provisions, but programs, processes, and their impact on their lives. Civic education and awareness is very important. And oftentimes I like to say civic education is more important after the ballot. Oftentimes we focus on civic education during the ballot. Who are we voting for? That runs up to the ballot. Who are we voting for? Why are we voting for them? And those are fundamental and important questions. But what we need to be focusing on as Africans is beyond the ballot box. How do we engage with our politicians and our leaders after the election day? What are the ways in which we can intervene? How do we raise questions? How do we ensure that the motions that are brought in Parliament, both at a national and local level, speak to our realities? And that is why education is important, civic education and awareness. So before we even get to public participation, how can a person publicly participate or engage when they don't know how to? And oftentimes, leaders intentionally refuse to engage in civic education because it means an empowered electorate gets to ask difficult questions. And therefore, it is also up to us as citizens to educate each other. If we have an understanding of a situation and a context, how are we ensuring that more people understand how they should engage beyond the ballot? That is two. Who's in the room? Civic education and awareness. Three, what are the overarching needs of a nation? And oftentimes, the challenge with policy development is policy is developed short term. It doesn't address the issues that we're going to face in 10 years. The current crisis in Nairobi, for example, and allow me once again to speak about the challenges of a place I'm in, is that there's a housing crisis. And what seems to be the quickest and easiest solution is to build floors going up. But we forget the quicker we build floors up, the quicker we have and continue to have a sewage issue, an issue of access to sanitation, poor health quality. Are we checking the planning and processes of these buildings that are coming up? Are we leaving green spaces for young people and ourselves to engage in and indulge in, even as we build concrete jungles all around us? And Nairobi has become what we like to call a cabro city. Everything is cabro. It's a little concrete jungle. There's little room and space even for the rain to be absorbed in the soil because we've taken up everything. What is the impact of that long term? And when we're thinking about policy, we need to think about the long-term impact of the decisions and the motions that we make. So those are some of the things we need to think about. When we implement a policy now, how will it alter the lives of Africans and our constituents in years to come? And finally, regular dialogue. When you're designing a process, you need to leave room for change, an opportunity and space for us to say, this may have worked 5 years ago, but is it working now? But even if it's still working, how can we tweak it to ensure that we are giving it room where necessary to revisit such important governance issues, such as, for example, the centrality of human rights in the structure of a country's constitution? Do we have a strong independent judiciary? Do we have systems that are working? Do we have a healthcare system that is working? A policy that is ensuring that there's spatial justice. And I'm going to be speaking about spatial justice further along because it's something that's a passion of mine, and I think more African governments should pay keen attention to. We are currently grappling with digital technology and AI in Africa, and oftentimes we don't stop to ask, what is the impact of AI and this democracy on the lives of Africans? How do we protect Africans? When our governments are partnering with international organizations and private international companies, how often do they ask, is this for the benefit of our citizens? Will it protect their lives? Will it lead to more prosperity? What are not just the economic outcomes, but the social outcomes? What are the socio-economic outcomes of engaging in this way? And therefore, when we think about the process, for us to be able to get effective outcomes, ensure wealth distribution, the process is where we need to spend a considerable amount of time designing processes that make sense when we are developing policies across the continent. And again, I would like to highlight how culture plays a central role in how we think. And I think it was Wangari Maathai who said, and I will be paraphrasing, culture is dynamic and evolves over time, consciously disregarding retrogressive traditions. And she gave an example at that time about female genital mutilation and about embracing aspects that are good and useful. And oftentimes we ignore the power and impact of culture when it comes to policymaking and design. What are the attitudes, perceptions, and feelings around a particular subject? And here I come to the conversation around protecting minority rights and marginalized communities. What are the perceptions, the prevailing narratives around these communities? How have they prevailed? And how can we ensure that there's an element of behavior change when we want to design policies? Because it's not just enough to design policies. You must ensure that the people are coming along with you. And that means altering the conversation, giving space as leaders to take a step back and ask the questions. How are we harming community? By ensuring that we are perpetuating negative and harmful stereotypes. Is there even room for our leaders to ask those questions? Within the region of East Africa, we are having many, many challenges when it comes to protecting the lives and livelihoods of those who identify in the LGBTQI community. And the most fundamental thing here, in addition to addressing policies and legislation, decriminalizing it, is changing the culture. And that's going to take some time, because this means engaging both state and non-state actors who oftentimes come together to fight a common agenda. And therefore, these are some of the things we need to think about when we think about what does it even mean to design legal systems, market structures that comprise different voices? Why is it important to have different voices in one space and not to ignore others? Because it doesn't feel, because you don't like a certain group of people. That's not reason enough for you to withhold their rights. Every single person on this continent deserves to live a dignified life. Therefore, it means when we are designing systems, when we are designing policies, that should be the central point in our mind. Social inclusion can only be achieved if it is a conscious choice for societies. This moves beyond policies. It moves beyond us saying, well, this is on paper. It moves beyond that and says, how are we engaging to ensure that societies are not some people are not being excluded from the conversation? And there are many ways that social exclusion happens. And I'll give some examples. One is a persecution via social media and via media, creating a hostile environment for minority communities and groups to engage. Two is a proliferation of harmful and stereotypical narratives. And because I've worked in the gender space, I will give an example of how gender representation has been fought over the years, especially when it comes to social integration. Because oftentimes when a woman wants to run for politics, she may not have the resources that most men have. Oftentimes, women are unaware of what is needed to prepare for an election. And political parties don't create an environment for women to easily access this information. In fact, it's even made even more difficult. But in addition to that, is a stereotype of women simply being flower girls, not having the temerity or the muscle to run and lead nations. And you find it in how we engage women. I want you to take a step back and think about how we think about women, even when it comes to the media. How do we report about female politicians? And that's another form of social exclusion. Perpetuating harmful narratives about them and who they are, and why they shouldn't have a seat at the table, and why it is actually to a country or a nation's benefit to exclude them. Another common example, especially in Kenya, we use religion to perpetuate harm towards minority communities. We refuse to integrate because we want to promote a false sense of nationalism, a false sense of religion and Christianity that is inhumane. But those are some of the ways, when we think about social exclusion, it's strategic. And what sometimes may look like that is scattered and uninformed is usually a strategic way to ensure that people are marginalized politically, physically, culturally, and socially, making them unable to access the things that they need to live, refusing them education, refusing them health, refusing them services that are going to improve their lives. So these are some of the things we need to consider when we think about what does social inclusion add to poverty reduction? Why is it important? Why do we bring social inclusion into the conversation of poverty reduction? And the reason is because although social inclusion is intrinsic to poverty reduction, it is also distinct from it, but it is a factor that ensures the more inclusive we are as a society, the less poor we are. There's data-driven evidence that shows that. How do we ensure when we are having conversations around including those who matter, we take into consideration that 10 years from now, we will actually be much better off as a society if we design a country that benefits all and not just a few? Which means, and I want to come back to the issue of Nairobi and Mathare, and it's a practical live example. If we had policies that were inclusive, legislation and programs that were inclusive, the minute residents of Mathare lost their homes due to floods, there would be processes in place that would give them temporary shelter, that would give them access to food as they figured themselves out. Remember, these are people who've not just lost their homes, they've lost their belongings, and they've also lost loved ones. Many children, women, and young men died during these floods. A system, therefore, that works for everyone ensures that we have considered what would happen when these people's lives are at risk. Our response mechanisms consider their challenges. And this includes the challenges not just of women, persons with disabilities, people who have same-sex relations, migrants, people who don't have documentation. We are all deserving of living in dignity. And therefore, how do we design policies and programs that reflect that? Because the cost of social exclusion can accrue through different channels and levels. And long-term, this means in 10 years or 20 years, people who are unable to access quality education turn to different forms of crime to be able to make a living. The trajectories of entire economies are skewed when we don't invest in a way that is inclusive. And this includes the loss of wages, lifetime earnings, poor education, employment outcomes are the most common measures of cost. But we also forget people die early because they're unable to access quality healthcare. We have a weakened labor force that's unable to sustain themselves and society. What then does that mean long-term for us as a continent, as African countries and as a continent, when we are designing policies that do not reflect the lived experiences of African lives? And how do we draw lessons from studies that have a quantified economic cost of inequality, that demonstrate that inequality is costly for medium and long-term growth? And some data shows, and I think this is the economist Stiglitz, and I hope I've said his name right, in 2016, where he said, social exclusion can affect overall economic growth by 25%. And it accumulates over time and over years. So a question for us to reflect on and think about: how has social inclusion within our countries and overall as a continent deterred our economic growth? Where would we have been and where could we be if we begin to design policies today that are socially inclusive? I'm going to now take a minute break and ask Derek if there are any questions we can begin exchanging. I have a lot to say. I'm going to pause there and then perhaps Derek can take over.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for your time and for your insights. I have learned a lot. So I'm going to ask a few questions and then open the floor to the participants who are here. So my first question is with regards to the revolution that is going on right now, the tech revolution that is going on, AI, technology. So there's an opportunity there because Africa is the youngest continent in the world. So how do we then take advantage of this situation where we have access to technology? How do we leverage technology to increase citizen engagement when drafting these policies? Because you've said that one of the things that we need to look at is that the policies must reflect the lived experiences of Africans. And for us to increase that engagement, we have an opportunity here through technology. So in your view, how do you think we can leverage technology to do that?
Let me begin by saying last year there was the AI summit in London, and the number of African representatives who are there were less than 3, including the Minister of Nigeria, who's doing incredible work. Minister Bosun is one of the few leaders who's doing incredible work on digital tech and AI on the continent, ensuring that the lives of Nigerians matter. So when we're having, like you mentioned, a digital revolution and African voices are not present, what does that then mean? We are designing policies that are not inclusive from the get-go. And then the question then begs, is this an important element for our governments? Do they understand the impact of what will happen in 10 years if we are not sitting at the table? Are African governments individually and collectively lobbying to ensure that we start asking relevant questions? And I hinted to that at some point. How can AI tools be developed in a way that centers the user, and specifically the African user, protecting their rights, safety, and needs? What do other African nations, how can other African nations what can they do to play a role in shaping global governance and development of AI technology? And this comes again to the issue of, it's an important issue, and I believe one that I'm really trying to be politically correct, Derek, that our governments need to pay attention to. I don't want to say they're ignoring. I want to say that they need to pay more attention to, because the conversations are happening, deals are being made. But are we on the table when these deals are being made? Are we ensuring, because currently, especially when it comes to the shaping of AI, African labor is being used. But even though African labor is being used, AI platforms are still currently inherently racist. So while our labor is being used, it doesn't reflect in the outcomes. So are we involved in the processes of development? I'd like to say no. We are involved as labor because we are cheap. And then again, there lies a problem. We are expendable. Once we've been used as labor, will we be needed again? And these are things we need to think about as Africans and individual countries. How important is this an agenda for your country? If it is not, we are going to be left behind. And has been with a lot of things, we are going to be used and discarded.
Thank you so much for that. So I'll encourage our participants. You can drop your questions in the chat if you do not wish to speak. If you wish to speak, kindly raise your hand so that I can give you an opportunity to ask your question to Natasha directly. But just building up on that conversation of AI, I would like us to bring in now the aspect of decolonization, because you've said that culture is, we should first deal with the cultural aspect, change perspectives over time, and that is how we are able to even include people who for a very long time have been outside. It has always been the majority have their way. So then what is the place of decolonization in creating more inclusive policies, and how do we navigate around that? Because different states, different nations, different regions within the continent are suffering from the effects of colonization up to date differently. If you look at West African, the Francophone countries in West Africa, we are having a lot of military coups. If you look at most British-speaking, British colonized countries, the issue of LGBT community is becoming, there's a lot of criminalization of that marginalized community. So where is the place of decolonization in creating inclusive policy?
I think one of the things I would like to emphasize is the importance of memory, the importance of remembering where we've come from, the people who fought to shape our countries. And I don't know about other African countries. I'll speak in the context of Kenya and what's been happening in the arts and culture space. There's been a push for STEM, and I know you're a STEM guy, Derek. So this is not an attack on you, but STEM, STEM, STEM. We are also, the courses that are going to be taught in schools and universities have to prepare people for the market, which has then led to the decline in history, in geography, in the arts. And then what therefore then leads to is us not knowing what has led us to be where we are today, how the past has shaped where we are today. Therefore, our decision making, even as adults, is devoid of historical context. And when it comes to the conversation again of the LGBTQI community, it's going to be controversial, but I would like to ask, where does that come from, the criminalization? If we take a step back, it's colonial. It's a colonial concept, and our colonial masters, for lack of a better word, I'm trying not to get unemployed by the end of this panel, so I'm trying to be politically correct, is those who decriminalized it have made it legal in their countries. So the question for us remains, why are we not being introspective when it comes to designing a country and a continent that works for us? Why are we, and I like to have a different, again, let us take a step back. And we've been speaking about AI. And the thing about AI is when we talk about dignified work means the reason why these foreign organizations come to Africa for cheap labor is that we charge less than $1 a day. It is indignifying how little they pay young Africans to work. But when you have that conversation with a young African, because I did a little case study with some young men a while back, and they were like, this is better than nothing. They're paying me, I'm working, I didn't have a job. So they didn't even see what we were fighting for, because for them, they're like, that's a lot of English. Me, I'm happy with what I'm earning. So again, it's a cultural issue, believing that we deserve better, believing that what is there currently is not enough, that we deserve a public system and not a privatized system that works for all of us. And that's where decolonization begins, asking the difficult question, the power of memory, like I said earlier, remembering what it's taken for us to get to where we are. This week, we've lost someone who was instrumental to fighting for green spaces in Kenya, Zarina Patel. And I was asking some young people around me if they've heard of her, and not a single one said yes. And my heart broke all over again. So here, Zarina has died. So has her legacy died with her. And therefore, the work that remains to be done is for us to find ways for people to remember her, remember the role she played, together with Wangari Maathai and other Kenyans, to protect Uhuru Park, Central Park. The power of memory, recording our history, recording who we are, where we are. Everybody remembers Fela Kuti. Very few people remember his mother. His mother was the first woman to drive in Nigeria. Fela Kuti's mother was one of the first and only women advocating for Nigerian women to vote in Nigeria. How often do we speak her name? How often do we remember how she fought for the livelihoods and lives of Nigerian women who owe a lot to her currently? So these are the conversations we need to have when decolonizing is such a long and onerous process that includes remembering, documenting, and then mapping out what the future looks like for us. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing.
I'm passionate about decolonizing, so apologies.
No worries, no worries. I will ask another question before I open the floor, my last question, and I would like you to relate it to the work that you're currently doing at Futurelect. So my question is, yes. So my question is, when it comes to regional integration,
Yeah.
so right now we have 9 member states in the East African community. And we have other regional blocks like the SADC region and the ECOWAS economic blocks. So when it comes to regional integration, how do we ensure that our policies are aligned to each other to reflect the complexity of our African societies? Because if you go to Uganda, the culture is very different. You come to Kenya, I would say we are a bit more westernized, which is not a very good thing. And if you go to Tanzania, a different story. So where's the place of regional integration when it comes to creating inclusive societies, and at the same time understanding what you said first, who is in the room, the complexity. We are different, we come from different societies, we have different belief systems, different religions. So where's the balance when it comes to that between regional integration and the complexity of African societies?
I think I'm going to answer it twofold and then throw a question to the audience. I'd really love to hear the audience thoughts on this. First, I'll say East Africa is the most regionally integrated, both economically and socially. If you even look at our boundaries across the region, which is not common on the continent. If you look at our borders, there are very many markets in East African borders. But when you go to SADC, West Africa, they're just boundaries and borders, very little engagement, interaction across borders. But in East Africa, we found a way to culturally and socially integrate, which I think has been tremendous for us as EAC. However, the challenge with integration is you cannot integrate without accountability. And integrating further means we need to ask questions. For example, how do we quantify or what is the metrics with which we identify good governance in the region? Are our leaders willing to have that conversation? Are we having the conversation of what it means? Again, I'd like to go back because I was part of a committee that was shaping the conversation of the AU agenda when this was being designed, the 2063 agenda. The Africa we want, interconnectedness, an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. If we are taking the question of interconnectedness as reflected in Agenda 2063, is East Africa asking the questions around what is good governance for East Africa? Are we respecting human rights? I'm going to repeat that one because, are we respecting human rights as a region? Is there justice and the rule of law in the region? And therefore, integrating without interrogating these issues is a false level of integration. And I don't think it is possible for us to integrate any further if we do not actually address those challenges we are currently facing as a region. So the long and short of it is, we may be unable to go any further because of the current differences we face politically and the current time bombs that are within the region. Many ticking time bombs within the region that make it impossible for us to integrate. Finally, the many vested interests, for example, in a country like DRC, that other neighboring other neighboring countries have. So are we ensuring that the lives of those in the Democratic Republic of Congo are safe as East African leaders? The neighboring country, Sudan, it's been 1 year, it was 1 year last week since the war began. What role have East African leaders played in promoting peace and security in the region? That's when we want to have questions around economic integration. Those are some of the things we need to look at. But before we even look externally, how we are supporting each other externally, I would say it's impossible to integrate regionally if within yourself internally as a nation, the pillars of human rights, justice and the rule of law, democracy and good governance are weakened. And therefore, I think the first step to ensuring regional integration is first ensuring within your nation those pillars are strong. The socioeconomic outcomes of your citizens are much more healthy. And they give you a room for negotiation, partnership, and interconnectedness. Yeah, I hope I've answered the question, Derek.
Yes, you have clearly answered the question. So
Bakari.
Bakari,
Ah,
yes.
can I say no comment, please? Yeah, it's great on paper. That's all I'm going to say. It's great on paper. It's a long way to go.
Okay.
A long way to go. That's all I'm going to say. Again, I'm trying to
Okay.
keep my job.
You're, you're trying to keep it. Okay, thank you, Bakari, for that question. Samantha has a question, so I'm going to give her a chance to ask a question.
Okay.
Samantha, please.
Hi, Natasha. Great presentation. Well, I
Thank
don't know
you.
if my question is a proper question, but anyways, it's aligned with the LGBTQ and the minorities, but mostly that group. How do you navigate around the issue of us as Africans, or the majority of Africans are going against accepting them into the society and having policies that protect them in their own countries? Because we are also thinking, or we have a feeling that it's also going against our own rights as citizens in the country. Because at the end of the day, we don't want our children to learn about those concepts. We don't want our children to learn or accept that type of life as normal. So, in such a situation, how then do we ensure that their rights are considered and they're protected, whilst also protecting the rights of the citizens of the rest of the country? I think, yeah, that's my question. Because, okay, let me just add on a little bit. Because I was talking to someone, and their point was, I don't mind if they live their life in private or wherever they are, but I don't want them to enforce the concept of, oh, we need books that are teaching students or our children about this. We need our marriages to be accepted by the government, or that sort of thing. So they were like, okay, I don't mind if they live their lives and do whatever they're doing in private or wherever they are, but I don't want that to be the norm or something that's accepted in my community or in my church or in my country. So yes, with that thinking, how best can we then ensure that their rights are respected and they're observed, as well observing and respecting the rights of the rest of the continent or the rest of the country.
Can I
Samantha,
ask
before
you
you,
questions? Oh, sorry, yes?
yeah, Samantha, before you unmute, kindly introduce yourself, which country you're coming
Oh,
from, and how you're involved with Future Africa.
hi, sorry. I thought I was unmuted, so I actually asked the whole question to myself. Anyways, I'm Samantha Katsande. I'm from Zimbabwe, but currently based in Ghana. I'm a Future Africa Fellow alumni. Yeah.
Okay.
So my question was, or is, how do we, for people with LGBTQI community, how do we respect and ensure their rights are protected when the rest of the country or the rest of the continent
I heard
feels
your
like
question.
yeah, you heard my question, right?
I heard your question, and I want to ask you a question back, Samantha.
Okay.
And this is just dialogue, because the issue we're facing with that is twofold. One is behavior change. Two is the adoption, which is happening all over Africa, of the radical right agenda, American radical right agenda that's been adopted in Africa. Because they're majority funding, so oftentimes even the talking points of our African leaders are not theirs. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think the question to you would be, because you said, I don't mind them being there, but I don't want them in my face.
Something like that.
Something like that. So I think let me focus on what justice is. And I want us to look at it from the lens of justice. Justice means that we all have a right to live a dignified life. And I'll give an example of Christians and Muslims, which sometimes can be a challenge. Oftentimes be like, I don't want, you hear Christians say, I don't want these Muslims to impose their religion on us. I'm happy with them existing, but I don't want them to impose their issues on us. And you hear the same thing with Muslims. I'm happy with them, with Christians existing, but I don't want them to impose their faith on me. And it isn't a question of imposing. It is a question of whether they deserve to live amongst us. And the answer is yes. No one deserves to live in hiding. No one deserves to live in fear of their lives being harmed. And as a, by the way, Samantha, data shows that children are more affected by sexual content that is rarely homosexual online and on TV, but the sexual content that is heterosexual. They are more harmed by the proliferation of this on TV and of violence than they are of homosexual presence around them. So again, that's a narrative that's been perpetuated. And there's data and evidence that shows there's actually no data to prove that children are harmed when they understand to live in harmony with other people. And what we are teaching our children is that this person may be different from you. This person may have a disability. They may need a wheelchair, but that doesn't mean they don't deserve to access good quality education, good healthcare. Because when we begin to say, oh, I'm okay with the LGBTQI community as long as it's not in my face, then we begin to say then they need special hospitals, they need special schools, they need to live in a bubble that's far away from us because we don't want to be contaminated by them. And again, that's unjust. It robs them of their dignity. And there are ways we can live together with people we don't relate with in many ways and thrive. So again, it's a question of justice. Justice is justice. Is it just for them not to be able to access quality healthcare because they've been discriminated against? No. Is it unjust for them to be kicked out of schools of accommodation because it happens especially in Uganda and Kenya? They can't access housing. They can't access healthcare. They're kicked out of schools. They're bullied both online and offline. So when we say that, my rights matter, I don't want them to interfere in my rights, are we really being sincere and just? And that's a question I'll leave for all of us to think about. It's a question of justice. Everybody deserves to live a dignified life. And the thing about developing and designing laws, as someone who's designed laws for years, drafted laws for years, I will tell you, it is very easy to say, well, those people, we can criminalize their activity because it doesn't seem to affect us. But as easy as it is to criminalize one thing, it is as easy to take away another right. If we accept for one right to be taken away, we are in a way saying that other rights can be taken away. There's a justification for those rights to be taken away, which will eventually happen. I hope I've answered your question, Samantha.
Yes, you did, but you also brought other questions. But anyways, time is up, but yeah. Yeah, because it kind of linked to the example you gave about STEM in terms of it's the Western or non-Africans are the ones who are pushing the agenda of STEM, and then we tend to forget the history and everything that's important to us as Africans. Yeah. So it's also more or less the same in the situation whereby our parents or older generation are thinking that, okay, LGBTQ plus is not something that has been part of our culture. So if we accept it, it's sort of like colonization of our culture. People are trying to push it into our face. And at the end of the day, we also tend to forget the norm that we're used to or the norm that we grew up with. So I think at the end of the day, it's a complicated situation, and each side will always have a way of defending why they're doing what they're doing and why it's important, because the people who are pushing for STEM are talking about, oh, we need innovation, we need to tackle climate change, we need to do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, and at the end of the day, we need more people in STEM for us to be able to solve challenges that we're facing as a continent and as the world. and also people who are pushing for LGBTQ plus are also talking about what you're saying, justice. I also have a right to live. I also have a right to access to education and healthcare and everything. So I think, I don't know if there will ever be a common ground, and I don't know if we'll ever get to understand where we are all coming from and be at peace with each other and accept each other as who we are and how we are coming into the picture, and we all need to survive. And yes, that whole thing. But yeah, thank you
So
for it.
I'll just throw something your way, and I'd really love to engage with you after this, and for you to send me an email after you've done some research. Is criminalizing homosexuality, because you said it's not been part of our community. I'd like to throw some challenges your way. One, monogamy as it is designed is not part of African culture.
Yeah.
In a majority of African households, it was in fact necessary for a woman to sleep with another man to ensure that just in case her husband's bloodline was cursed, or someone wanted to harm, the other child that she had with someone else would still survive. That's just one example of how our culture was and is. African culture is very diverse. It's evolved. So I want to challenge you and say, please look into the history of homosexuality, especially within the continent, and then give me feedback as to saying that, this is a Western concept. Another thing I want you to look into is the people who are funding the push for criminalizing homosexuality in East Africa. Is it Africans or is it Western nations, particularly the far right in America? I want you to look into that and also give me feedback. Sometimes everything is not as it seems. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so that we can allow as many people to ask questions, I'm going to open the floor if anyone else has any question. Thank you, Natasha, for that. And thank you, Samantha, for your question. Interesting thoughts there from Christabel, who says there's a great book on that called Boy Wives and Female Husbands, Studies in African Homosexualities.
Thank you.
I don't know if anyone else has a question or a comment that you'd like to ask Natasha. This is your chance. You can just raise your hand and I will request you to unmute. Going once. Okay. There seems to be no response. So I'll just go ahead and ask a question. So Natasha, I'd like you to briefly talk about the work that you're doing at Futurelect, because the vision of Future Africa is to create public sector leaders. The vision is to empower and nurture the next frontier of public sector leaders, which is closely related to the work that you're doing at Futurelect. So plug yourself.
Oh, I plug myself. Well, I think, can I also just begin by saying what Futurelect is? But before I do that, the two things that Futurelect does. One, it should build the capacity of young Africans, particularly women and youth, by preparing them to seek political office or to join the public service. Number two is to build vibrant and engaged electorates by empowering them with the knowledge necessary to participate energetically in civic and democratic spaces. And Futurelect is a not-for-profit organization and a non-partisan organization that was developed and established in 2018 by Lindiwe Mazibuko. Lindiwe Mazibuko is the first Black opposition leader, parliament opposition leader in South Africa. And it's an independent, not-for-profit organization. And our mission is to improve public service for more people throughout the continent by supporting a new generation of 21st century ethical and transformative leaders. And to achieve this, we've designed and delivered multiple nonpartisan, intensive interdisciplinary leadership and development training programs to diverse and ethical leaders across the continent. The East African program, which I lead, I'm the regional director for East Africa. I am charged and tasked with establishing various things. The first one is the East African Public Leadership Program, and Derek is one of our cohort members. He's incredible. And the purpose of this cohort, we have a cohort of 18 East Africans, is to prepare them for political office and public leadership by equipping them with public understanding, practical understanding of the terrain ahead. What does it look like? You want to do this thing. Are you able to do this thing? Do you have the tools necessary to navigate these spaces? The second thing I'm going to be establishing at the end of this year and early next year is a Women in Public Office program. And this one is specifically designed for young political leaders, women political leaders, and public servants in government, both at a local and national level across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And the reason this is tailored is because more often than not, we need to help and empower and create spaces where women are ready to lead and understand the different dynamics that affect them, not just as a bloc, but as a community. So WIPO is going to be reflecting the same WIPO that's been designed in South Africa. The only difference is I'm going to be expanding it to the 3 African countries. And finally, I will be establishing, and this is going to be next year, a civic education platform where we're going to be having conversations with the wider electorate around what it means to be an engaged electorate. What legislations, policies are in place? How do you participate? At what level do you participate? What conversations do you need to be having at a local level, and what conversations do you need to be having at national level? And those 3 pillars are designed around the 2 things that I mentioned earlier: building the capacity of leaders and establishing a vibrant electorate that participates beyond the ballot box. And a personal thing for me in that is that I'm hoping in the next 15 years, the next president in one of the East African countries will be from Futurelect. But even more so at a practical level, we have the Ugandan elections in 2026, the Kenyan elections in 2027. I'm looking to see more Futurelect fellows join parliament.
Yes, and I've also been reminded Future Africa as well is building the capacity of young Africans to join the public sector and take up political leadership, because it is important. I have been able to appreciate the role of politics in influencing all sectors in our economy. So, Natasha, I would like for you to give us your closing remarks, since there are no more questions. I would like you, and this is very specific, I would like you to talk to. Oh, okay.
Sorry,
before you close, let me just give Soila Sankali a chance. Hello.
Sorry, you're going in and out, and it's just me.
Okay, sorry about that. Before I invite you to give your closing remarks, let me just Soila had requested to ask a question.
Can't hear.
You can ask.
Derek, can everybody else hear him? It could be my network.
Yes, I can hear Derek.
I can hear him.
Soila, please go ahead.
Hi, Natasha.
Oh, you can
Hi,
hear
Derek,
him, so I guess it was only me. Thanks, Christabel. And thank you for sharing that book. I really enjoyed Boy Wives, Christabel. I think my only remark, because a lot of you are going to be leaders, and you're going to be great leaders.
Natasha,
I was going through some of your profiles. I think the only thing I could say is, 1, be prepared for the terrain of developing policy. That's very difficult and very brutal. Number two, especially for the women, don't be afraid to lobby. Don't be afraid to create allyships across the board. And the key to designing effective policy is also understanding that oftentimes you'll need to work with your enemy. How do you success of lobbying that ensures you're amplifying the lived experiences and voices of young Africans, women, youth, and marginalized communities is by creating allies from the get-go, partnering with organizations, with individuals that are like-minded, but also identifying political leaders, especially if you don't want to get into political office, but want to develop policy and legislation for your region. Identify an ally in parliament. Begin building a relationship with this politician. And oftentimes I say, politicians are always looking to be a champion of something. Find someone who needs a cause to champion and let them be the face of your bill, of your policy. Walk them through the importance of it and the benefit of them being the champions of that bill and policy. That often is what is the sausage making of policy development. Partnering sometimes with people who are perceived as your enemy, finding allies within parliament, speaking to them in a language that they understand. If you want a bill that is gender responsive, it is very difficult for it to be passed in a room full of men by saying it's going to benefit women. Find a way, and a key example is the current Justice of the Supreme Court of Kenya, Njoki Ndung'u, when she wanted to reduce the cost of taxes on pads. She didn't say this is going to benefit the lives of women when she was engaging. Then she was an MP in parliament. When she was engaging, she did was that she told them, buying pads for your wife, buying pads for your daughter is going to be expensive because of the taxes. But if you reduce it, it actually reduces So when you're pitching something, you're pitching a policy, the question then is to ask, how is this going to benefit the person to whom I'm pitching? You know your agenda. You need to find a way to make your agenda their agenda and get that policy passed. And with that, I wish everybody well. Thank you for making time for this. It's a Saturday afternoon. You could have been doing many other things. Thank you for being with me on the call. That's all I have to say for now. Derek, can you hear me? I hope you can.
Yes, I can. Your network bandwidth is a little low, but we could hear you throughout your closing remarks. There was I closed off Soila. She had a question, so I'm going to let her ask her question, and then we can close the forum. Soila.
Derek, apparently mine wasn't a question. I just wanted to make a general comment that this has been a thought-provoking afternoon. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Future Africa and Natasha, for bringing this together. I've just seen on the comments that we need to partner for more of these kind of conversations, and I think it is true. And for Natasha, I just want to say you're doing a very good job with Futurelect as one of the first cohort fellows. And this is what Africa wants. So thank you so much, everybody, and God bless you all.
Natasha, would you like to say something?
I think my network has an issue.
Yeah, you can maybe
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Maybe you can try to...
I could hear Soila in and out. I didn't hear her question clearly.
She didn't ask a question. She was just making a comment and saying how the session was informative. So yeah, she was just closing off with a comment. Maybe you can try to turn off your video. Maybe we'll get you more clearly. Can you hear us now clearly?
I can hear you. What was her comment?
Oh, she was expressing her gratitude for your time and also saying that we should increase collaboration, such collaborations, and have such discourse about the African continent. So yes, that was her comment in summary.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So there being no other questions, I want to check the chat and see. Yeah, there being no other questions, I would like to thank all of you participants for making time to attend this forum. I really do appreciate, because the forum wouldn't have happened if you're not there. And I would like to thank our guests. Natasha, thank you so much for your time, for taking your time on a Saturday evening to be able to attend this forum. And thank you for your insights. I am sure we've been challenged in terms of our thinking. We look at policy differently, and we are motivated to change our continent. So, Natasha, I'm going to do the last thing that I'm going to do before I officially close the forum. Natasha, are you there? Okay, Natasha is gone. So thank you so much all for making time to attend the session, and I really appreciate it. I would also like to thank Future Africa for creating this platform for us to engage and discuss about issues affecting our continent. I would like to also remind you about our programs. We have the fellowship, which the 2024 cohort is already set, and I think some of them are present here. Thank you for coming. And our ambassadors program, which is opening for applications in the next month. For the scholars program, we are currently running applications which close tomorrow. Thank you so much for making time to attend this session. I really appreciate all of you. And thank you to Natasha for making time in absentia. Otherwise, there being no comment, I would like to wish all of you a good evening. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and let's secure the future of Africa. Thank you so much.